Now wake me up before you go. Don't leave me hanging on like a yo-yo. Sorry, everybody, just wanted you to know the song that Magnus Carlsen sings in his head before the start of every game. This game being no exception against Grischuk from the 2015 World Blitz Chess Championship, a game that ultimately proved critical. Knight f3, c5, and then e3. We are headed toward a little bit of an unorthodox move order approach by Carlsen. Grischuk decides regular development makes the most sense. Then after knight f6, Carlsen immediately plays d4. g6 and then c3 by Carlsen ultimately leads us to this structure here, which is a very solid structure for white. It's a Tories type, Zukertort type, London type structure where this big dark square pawn chain here has the intention of maintaining a very solid and stable center with the idea of maybe putting the bishop here and getting an attack on the king side. But because Grischuk played the fianchetto system with the bishop coming to g7, that's going to make any chances for white to launch a successful kingside attack on this diagonal much less. The bishop is sort of biting on granite. So as you can see, after the moves g6 and b6, Carlsen decided to pause and take a think here. He wasn't exactly sure how he wanted to approach it, keep going into a Zukertort type structure, or maybe open the center and play for something a little more flexible, perhaps try to punish the fact that this diagonal has now been open. And on that note, Carlsen took on c5 and played e4, pointing out exactly the features of the position that I just described. The knight cannot take on e4 because queen to d5 would provide a fork to the knight and the rook on a8. Ouchtown, right? Grischuk has to pause and think for a moment because if he can't take this pawn, then he knows he's dealing with a much more dangerous structure for white out of the opening. The pawn on e4 might even just go to e5 on the next move. So pausing to think for a minute, also enjoying himself some Wham in his head, a fun song that everyone likes to sing. Grischuk apparently included in that. He decides to just play bishop to g7, sort of calling white's bluff, saying, well, if you play e5, I can likely put my knight on g4, and I don't see any immediately crushing tactics, so we'll see if you want to waste that much time in the opening rather than just developing your pieces. Carlsen isn't sure about it, or maybe he's thinking of his second favorite 80s song. But the game that happens in the middle game here is very equal for both sides. And we see critical play with both sides fighting over the d-file here in a moment. Ultimately, it was a very back-and-forth game until we get to the endgame where some of the real fireworks are going to start. So if you're just joining us for this video and thinking, oh, do I really have another 7 minutes to kill? Let me tell you something. You have 7 minutes to kill because this is Carlsen Grischuk World Blitz Chess Championship. Bishop to d3. Carlsen develops a piece, prepares to castle, just like his mama told him to. Grischuk is thinking, well, is there a reason to strike in the center, perhaps with a move d6 or d5? Decides against it. Castles, Rekharovka. Castles kingside for Carlsen as well. And both sides now feeling that they've gotten out of the tricky part of the opening. You're going to see that the next few moves are developed a little bit more quickly, a little bit of rapid fire since they're no longer worried about immediate tactics on the diagonal. And Grischuk feels that most of his dangerous problems are gone since Carlsen didn't go for e5 early. He plays d6. Carlsen thinks about it, both sides really taking their time at the early stage of this game, more than other blitz players behind them, as you can see Vasily Lagrave and Kramnik. Bishop e7, rook to e1, knight b to d7, and now h3, a solid sort of bigger picture waiting move, frees the back rank, maybe prevents black from bringing this knight to g4 and e5, but really it's kind of asking black what his plan wants to be. Because if black pushes this e-pawn to the wrong square, the structure then changes for white advantageously. The d-pawn will then be backward, and there may even be opportunities for the knight to target it. So he has to be careful with that. Grischuk doesn't want to play d5 on the other hand because of e5 and then maybe even e6. So as you can see, Grischuk is not exactly sure yet of which plan he wanted to take here. And pausing for a few moments, he reconsidered, right? Now, Carlsen's next few moves, if given the opportunity, will be a little more natural. He's going to bring out the dark square bishop. He's going to likely to either f4 or g5, as we see here. He did go to f4 to prepare e5. Grischuk responds with a4, trying to make this b2 pawn backward as a potential target. And Carlsen calmly plays queen to d2, completing his development officially, as beginners would know, because the rooks are connected. Grischuk plays bishop to c6, a useful move on several fronts. One, it supports the a-pawn so that this rook can freely leave it and maybe put pressure here, but also prepares a long-term idea of a potential battery with this queen and bishop on this diagonal. Remember that idea, boys and girls, because it comes back to haunt us. After rook a to d1, queen to b6, we see that Grischuk has two plans, gang up on the b-pawn, and again, this idea I already mentioned of the battery happening. But overall, the position has got to favor white as long as it opens up a little bit with all these pieces being primely developed in the center. Carlsen agrees and says it's time to play e5. I'm going to invite some exchanges because I'm hoping that my more coordinated pieces in the center will pay dividends as files and diagonals open up. But Grischuk either had this in mind or simply found queen to b7 over the board. My guess is he was preparing this idea all along, as I foreshadowed with bishop to c6. Because now Carlsen's put a little bit on the spot. He doesn't really want this bishop to come back to f1 where it's passively defending the g2 pawn. That might even open up central light squares. But playing f3 could have long-term negative effects on the dark squares. In the end, you'll notice that he opts for the latter. And though I think the game is still very equal, from a practical perspective, we slowly head toward a time scramble where white's king ends up being a little bit more open than black, which you can say yay or nay whether you agree with me, but I think it had something to do with the messy tactics that occurred later on, despite just the simple fact that we all know Carlsen didn't maybe have his best chess going in Berlin back in October. But Carlsen eventually decides on the ladder, as I said, with f3. Grischuk quickly puts a rook on the d file, and Carlsen unpins the bishop. Obviously, there may have been threats as long as the queen remained there. The game gets under time pressure here. In the next few moves, we're going to see that rapid-fire chess has to happen. If you're evaluating this position unbiasedly, I still think it's just about dynamically equal. White has a small positional edge because black's two isolated pawns over here, the c and the a pawn, and maybe even white has a 3-on-2. But because of white's potentially open king on these diagonal squares, as highlighted, and the fact that black has no other real permanent weaknesses to show, I think the position has to be considered more or less equal. Rook to c8, followed by knight to c4, and then bishop to d5. Bishop comes back to f1. Both sides are sort of putting their pieces on squares that are protected to make sure that nothing bad happens. Bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, and a lot of simplification happening quickly given that the players took a lot of time over the last few moves. And now we have an arbiter who's clearly not conscious of the fact that we're trying to watch a chess game here. Thanks, buddy. Thanks for moving on. Rook to d2 was played. Now it's time to trade, according to Grischuk, but let me tell you something. The problem with this is right up Carlsen's alley. He has a bishop for a knight with pawns on both sides of the board. Typically, the bishops will be better than the knights in those types of endings, especially with the 3-on-2 advantage. But as I said, don't forget that the open white king may be the practical factor that eventually causes Carlsen to blunder. He played b3. Sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit. That Mr. Arbiter there threw me off. But eventually we're in this position you see here live with Grischuk intending to head into the dark squares, Carlsen hoping to simplify and use his 2-on-1 advantage. A few more moves are played quickly here, and that's exactly the kind of thing we get to. Carlsen decides it's time to play b4 and use my extra b pawn. I should be better here, right? It's 4-on-4, but I'm the first person with a pass pawn, and I have a bishop for the knight. You might normally agree with Carlsen, but again, the white king is open. After queen to c3 and rook d2, we see Grischuk has intentions to come after the king on the dark squares. Rook e2 allows rook to d1, and that's a little bit dangerous, right? The bishop is pinned, and we know that could lead to some weird tactics. Carlsen is in trouble, though, because he doesn't want to unpin on the first rank. He'll just lose the rook. Decides that aggressive measures must be taken and plays g4. After g4, Grischuk is going to trade and then bring the knight into a more dangerous square. All of a sudden, it seems like tactics are flying. Theoretically, this position should be just fine for white, even if he had played rook takes c7, believe it or not. But after rook e3, queen to c1, and then rook takes e7, position gets much more dangerous for white. Rook to d2 was played, and Carlsen plays the ultimate blunder of the game. Queen e3 could have been met by queen to e1. Boomtown, knight takes f3, king h1, and rook h2 mate. But guess what? None of them saw it. You can tell I've been waiting to say that this whole time. And boom goes the dynamite. Queen to e1. It could have been checkmate. But okay, that didn't happen, Danny. Rejoin reality. After the move queen e3 was played, instead of that, of course, as we're getting to here, the move knight to e6 was played instead. Rook to e8 check, king to h7. Ultimately, the white king still ended up being ran out into danger. The current live position saw knight to g7, where both the bishop and the rook were hanging. Carlsen had to play bishop g2. Knight takes e8, allowed queen to c7 check. And here comes the attack on the dark squares. If black trades queens, it's over. Don't say I didn't tell you so. Guess what? Queen f6. Black traded queens and picked up the b pawn. You see Carlsen brings in the bishop, hoping to stay with the position with the bishop for the draw rook, bishop for the rook draw. But after g5, trading f-pawns is not a good idea, mainly because there's no way white doesn't lose the g5 pawn before the g6 pawn. Carlsen stands up, shakes his head, and clearly a dejected Carlsen. And with that, Grischuk signed the score sheet and the game was over. Just to back up and give you a quick instructive moment of what happened there, since I lost the way in my getting caught up in the moment of boom goes the dynamite. After rook takes e7, black could have also played king f8 immediately, but rook d2 was a practical move that makes a lot of sense. Queen e3, as I said, could have been met by the brilliant queen e1, as I pointed out, but with knight e2 check played, from a practical perspective, black's moves make a lot of sense. Knight f4, by the way, is not takeable because it's a discovered double check. Knight e6 is still threatening moves like rook g2 check, winning the queen. So even with computer analysis showing criticism to black's moves that he could have won faster, like for example here, queen to g1 again was probably a little more accurate than knight takes e8, Grischuk really played all the best human moves and eventually got to this endgame where it's easy to win with rook versus bishop, and that's ultimately why he won. So congratulations to Grischuk, this being probably the biggest win of the tournament. Beating the world champion with black doesn't happen every single day. We appreciate you. We appreciate everybody for watching, and have a good one. See you on Chess.com.